The history of First Nations in BC. The coast climate creates ideal conditions for the temperate rainforest. It covers the mountains, which rise out of the ocean, creating water channels that run into bays. The southern interior covers the eastern slopes of the coast mountains to the peaks of the Rockies. Between these mountains is a series of shorter ranges divided into a sequence of valleys. The northeast region stretches along the Peace River and is separated from the rest of the province by the Rocky Mountains. And the northern interior, the environment of the northern interior is similar to most of northern Canada. It holds animals such as moose, elk, deer, wolves, and coyotes. Traditional resource gathering. Plants. Plants were important raw material for many aspects of First Nations' daily, ceremonial, and spiritual life. Hundreds of different plants provided food as well as materials for medicine, tools, dyes, containers, fuel, and fiber. Fishing techniques. Many skills were required to catch fish and preserve a good supply of salmon. Usually, catching fish was a cooperative effort involving a family group operating a fish trap. Hunting. Hunting was a traditional way of life for the First Nations. They hunted moose, elk, and deer. The First Nations knew a lot about hunting. They knew the behavior of the animals and what they were going to do. They stalked them and all of that. Usually, when they went hunting, it was a group effort. They would use archery or something along the lines of that. They also trapped animals, such as beavers. What they would do is they'd lead an animal into a trap and drop something on them. Traditional economies. Traditional economies were based on working together to provide for the whole group. The First Nations of BC are believed to be the most active and expert traders of their time. Factors that have existed for thousands of years contribute to their highly developed economy. There would be a whole group of people that contributed in these trades. These trades happened all over the place. Some of the stuff they traded was oolican grease, red cedar, copper. First European contact. The first recorded encounter was part of a Spanish spy mission to see what the Russians were up to. In 1744, Juan Perez anchored a ship on the tip of Haida Gwaii. Multiple groups came up to the ship on canoes to investigate. The Spanish made a short trip on the coast of Vancouver Island to the New Chattel, maritime and land-based fur trade. In the 25 years following Cook's stop on Vancouver Island, nearly 200 ships came from Britain, Spain, and the United States to engage in the sea otter trade. As they traded for furs, the European mariners followed their policy of claiming sovereignty over the land. The Russians and Americans proclaimed sovereignty, as did the Spanish and the British, who focused their energies on trying to claim the Nootka Sound. After the short-lived international crisis in the 1790s, the imperial powers soon lost their interest in the northwest coast and colonial power, which was left to the fur trades. The First Nations traders brought furs to the ships because they could. The First Nations integrated the European presence into their traditional social system. They treated the visitors as they would chiefs from a visiting village, conducting welcome ceremonies and blowing eagle down as a sign of peace. The chiefs expected an exchange of gifts to begin the negotiations on a positive note. The European traders soon learned that the First Nations were expert traders and bargainers. Often women in the trading party had important say in what the final price should be. Probably the most sought-after trade item was iron. Iron came in the form of chisels and axes, but anything made of iron could be shaped into sharp tools and were easier to use than tools made of stone or shell. Firearms were also desired greatly, since as a furs a hunter could acquire, adding to his family's wealth. Copper and cloth were also high in demand. Copper was formed into shields that symbolized wealth, and cloth. The First Nations were really into alcohol, and they spent their money and traded to have it. By the 1900s, the beaver population had significantly been reduced, and the beaver could no longer be traded. Diseases and epidemics. Europeans arrived in the early 18th century. There were around 200,000 to 400,000 First Nations people. By the 1900s, this number dropped to around 25,000. The diseases that arrived were measles and smallpox. These diseases were uncommon back then, especially in Canada. The first epidemic occurred in the 1770s when smallpox broke out. Smallpox went through Chilanga territory through the Spanish. 1782, a terrible smallpox epidemic went through, swept up from Mexico through Storlo territory and through the trading routes. Captain George Vancouver saw overgrown empty villages that was the first evidence of the epidemic. The last epidemic of smallpox devastated a lot of the First Nations people, killing over 70% of the population. The last epidemic of smallpox happened in 1862. The government made First Nations move up north to limit the epidemic. They were forced at gunpoint. The northern virus hit the First Nations harder than any of the gunboats would have. The epidemic killed many important people and destroyed some of the First Nations culture.
When Canada became a country in 1867, the British North America Act continued the colonial policy of discriminating against First Nations people by enforcing government control. The government took overall responsibility for Indian affairs, meaning the governments of First Nations communities and lives. The provinces controlled the land and natural resources, which gave them the power to regulate land uses such as hunting, trapping, and forestry. Under the direction of Joseph Church, Minister of Lands and Works, Aboriginal title to the land was denied. The provisions of the Royal Proclamation of 1763 were ignored or dismissed as irrelevant to BC.
It's red.
The colonial government refused to negotiate treaties. First Nations had no part in the negotiations regarding entry to Confederation. Joseph Church was content to admit First Nations people from the agreement, but the federal politicians insisted on including them, and Section 13 was added. Federal politicians didn't understand the conditions experienced by First Nations in BC. They assumed their situation was similar to First Nations in Ontario, which had 80 acres per family. Politicians felt it confirmed the 10-acre allotments that the colonial administration had previously distributed. And BC joined Canada in 1871, and Joseph Church became the new province's first lieutenant governor. The Allied Indian tribes folded after it was made illegal to pursue land claims. However, there was still a great deal of work to be done to advance Aboriginal rights and the fair treatment of First Nations people. A new organization emerged in the Depression of the 1930s known as the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia. It began on the fishing grounds of the North Coast in 1931. Self-determination has several factors. People to govern in a way that they determine how the resources of their traditional territory will be used and to be able to derive economic benefit from the resources. This would be improving the First Nations' economic, social, and cultural conditions on their country. There are more than one way that self-government can be put in place. National government is based off an identified group of people, usually a band or group of bands, that identifies First Nations people with traditional land base, controlling the local governance of their territories. A public government model included all people who live in a certain region, not just First Nations, and has authority over everybody who lives within its boundaries. It also incorporates traditional First Nations cultural values and practices. A community of interest is a more limited type of government that might be used in places that come from different First Nations but share common needs and interests. Members would join voluntarily to take up specific responsibilities. However, government structure, certain factors need to be in place for this to work. Large enough population willing to put into practice other levels of government, and government would need to be willing to empower the community